I'm Gold Derby News and Features Editor Ray Richmond, and I'm welcoming nine-time Oscar nominee Ren Klyce, re-recording mixer, sound designer, and supervising sound editor on the Netflix feature The Killer. Ren, how big a challenge was it as a sound designer and editor to work on a film where the lead character, played by Michael Fassbender, says so little on camera, where we mostly only hear his thoughts?
Yes, that was actually a really sort of the starting point from where the picture editor, Kirk Baxter, and David Fincher, they landed at a rhythm in terms of the picture edit. David wanted to have very little dialogue, and he achieved that, but there was a lot of narration. So even though the lead character, we hear him speaking a lot, we barely see him actually speak on camera. He only has several lines in the entire 2 hours that you're watching the film. However, you hear him speaking in voiceover and narration form, and that rhythm of that set up a whole sort of chain of events whereby Fincher wanted to have the characters' POV be clear of narration. So anytime we were looking through the eyes of Fassbender, we would hear no voiceover, but we would hear, for example, very loud source music coming from his earbuds. The Smiths, for example, would be very loud. And so that was sort of a discovery that Fincher and Kirk came about in the cutting room, cutting the picture. And then once they decided and arrived at that, then that set up a whole next step of, well, then how does that voiceover only being when we are looking at the killer and not from his eyes, how do we then fill those gaps with sound pressure? And that created the vertical sound cutting technique that we came up with for the soundtrack.
It's very unique and unusual, and it's very noticeable. And I don't, I watched the movie knowing I was going to be speaking to you, and it really stood out just how different the sonics were on this film, which I think really speaks to your talent and ability to make it stand out. Besides that, I think what The Killer was shot in multiple locations. I know, Ren, Paris, the Dominican Republic, New Orleans, Chicago, I guess in Florida and New York too. Were you looking to curate different sounds in each of those places?
Yes, we really wanted, and Fincher wanted, and the sound team really was striving. We all were striving to create to get a feeling of each location being unique. Paris, of course, we don't see Paris very much. The film opens up and we are in a room. It's a WeWork space, so we don't really have any visual indication that we are in Paris, except for, of course, it states it says Paris very quickly. So if you blink, you miss that. So instead, we had to fill in what normally would be a visual cue to the sound. So curating the sounds of the sirens of Paris, the unique sounds of the church bells, voices, of course, language. And one of the things that was interesting was a lot of the sounds I had recorded from years ago being in Paris on vacation. And what I was struck by in Paris was just the sound of people walking in the streets. The shoes the women wear and the men are different. They're harder. There's more stone. And that creates a beautiful clip, clop, echoey texture that's different. And you hear it. And, it's when you go on vacation, you go to a new place, you go to Tokyo, for example, it's a different experience visually and orally. And that was one of the things that was unique and fun about this project was that, you find a sound, you go, oh, this is a cool sound. We put it, and you find a little spot where that little kid laughing or calling to his mama would be able to go, things like that. So it was sort of a process of finding a fun sound that felt French, for example, or felt New Orleans or felt Dominican Republic, but then needed to find a home.
Yeah, you don't think about that there's different sounds to different cities. And you're right, the clip clop. I always imagine, yeah, the women walking in heels and stuff around Paris, and that would have that sound. Whereas I would imagine in Tokyo, you'd be hearing lots of hustle and bustle, and transportation, and just lots of chatter in the street. And
Yes,
probably maybe more rural sounds I would think of in the Dominican Republic.
sure.
And
The
that
irony,
puts
I'm sorry.
us in, and sorry, that really puts us in the story.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, I was going to say, you were talking about Tokyo. The irony of that is that when I was in Tokyo on vacation, became obsessed with the late night motorcycles that would zoom by. And some of those sounds are actually in the Paris sequence. So there is cheating for sure. You know, when the killer's lying on the bed and he can't sleep, and you see the lights and lighting up the room, and you hear the sound of the motorcycles 10 blocks away, those are actually recordings from Japan. But the idea is to give the sense of a late night empty city and a fast riding motorbike through the streets going way too fast, despite where it came from, gives you the sense of when, which is late night in that example.
Even the silences in this film, though, Ren, really seem to have a sound, which I know sounds bizarre, but there's a really distinctive element to the silence that also is riveting in the story, which I'm sure was intentional.
Yes, we try to craft that to give the audience a break, and also to create to sort of, and Fincher was the one who wanted this and sort of was asking for this, which is to sort of what he calls to train the audience. This is when the killer speaks. This is when he's listening. This is when we hear him as the camera hears him, where the earbuds are very tinny and small. And now when we're looking through his eyes, for example, the music's really loud. And that juxtaposition of cutting back and forth between loud Smiths and quiet Smiths, or just looking through his scope and hearing the hum of his mind as he's imagining shooting his target, for example, those vertical cuts, David was really wanting to establish early on in the film. And it was a lot more editing work for us, but ultimately I think it was worth it, because despite all the perspective cuts on nearly every cut that Kurt and David made, you know, we arrived at those edits.
You mentioned David Fincher, your director. How involved was he in the sound designs? It sounds like heavily involved. I read that he wanted to make it sound, quote, very antisocial. What does that mean?
Antisocial. I haven't heard that one, Ray.
Yeah.
But to answer your first question, he's very involved. In fact, he came to the studio, my studio here in Northern California, which is where I am right now, and really wanted to just sit and work on the experimentation of the mix on the early stages of the film. He arrived at a cut with his picture editor, Kirk Baxter, and David was like, you know, it might be a good time now to let's experiment now with the sound. He gave Kirk a little break from cutting, and then came here, and then we just started to experiment with sound, and that's when he really was like, let's do this, let's give me more vertical cuts. And you know, our instinct as sound editors, and when we're mixing sound, is to have the sound run horizontally, because what we don't normally want to do is draw attention to the vertical picture cuts. The visual cuts, when you think about it, they're very strange things if you really actually think about a picture cut, and the mind has to sort of take a leap of faith that nothing out of the ordinary is happening, but in fact the camera is moving all over the place. So the picture editor wants to have those edits be invisible, so that the audience is just following the story and feeling the characters and feeling the energy and the direction of the filmmaker. However, David wanted to not do that. He wanted to have these cuts, sonic cuts, coincide with the vertical picture cuts and draw attention to the cuts, which is something that we generally strive not to do, because we don't want to draw attention to those things. And what's fun about Fincher and his involvement, to answer your question, is that he really wanted to push that envelope a lot. In fact, he wanted to do that as early as Fight Club, but we ended up kind of not doing that as much, because we experimented with it a little bit, but it was a little too exhausting. So I think this time he really enjoyed getting to get that texture that he was craving.
You have such a technical job, Ren, and you're very good though at making it sound interesting and understandable to the layman, which I applaud you for.
Appreciate that.
Did you? It sounds like you approached the job as almost like you're one of the storytellers, which I don't imagine is always the case for somebody doing sound, but it sounds like that's absolutely something you take pride in.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, it's certainly. I mean, I learned a lot on this film. I mean, you know, I think I learn every time. I always think, oh, you know, I'm finally figuring out how to do my job, you know. But then you get a new project and you realize that you're just learning a whole new set of skills, which I actually really like. I like the idea that, you know, there's still sort of a beginner mentality to the approach. And I think that's actually a healthy way to do any type of work, honestly. But I do feel that David Fincher pushes his sound team, pushes us to with that narrative. You know, he'll really ask for things specifically in sound, and not only that, he will work with his writer to write those things, sounds into the screenplay. So, for example, Andy Kevin Walker, our writer, he was the writer on Seven, and Andy would even write sound design cues into the actual script, which he did as well in The Killer. And then David got excited about those ideas, and then he would create visual cues or sounds that the killer would hear that weren't there on the day, but he would tell Michael Fassbender, okay, at this point you hear something, you look. And the cinematographer, Eric Messersmith, would say, do we need to have a POV? Do we need to photograph that POV? And David would say, no, we're just going to have a sound there. So David is definitely a driving force behind a lot of the planning. And what's great about that, though, is that because he comes up with that idea, that then it gets us excited to go, okay, well, now let's raise the bar and do more of those types of off-screen curated specific sounds and fill in detail, which then hopefully will wrap the audience in a texture of a place or a state of mind. You know, things like anxiety are very important to Fincher. There's a scene where he misses the shot in Paris, and he finally gets to the airport after he is so paranoid that the dog's going to catch him by smelling the gunpowder, and he finally gets on a plane. And there's this ascending jet that David wanted. You know, I want the jet to go higher and higher and higher and cut off, as if his anxiety is like, I just want to get on that plane. And as soon as I get on that plane, I'm safe. So, you know, David definitely asks for those things. Like, what can we do to make him feel anxious? And then we'll come up with the sound of a jet that cuts off. So there's a lot of fun, collaborative experimentation. And you know, what's great about him is he's into it, and he loves experimenting, and gives us the time to get those sounds played.
That's fascinating, because I mean, you're really ratcheting up the tension with what you're doing. That is storytelling for sure. I mean, you're absolutely an intrinsic part of it, and you're working closely with the music department, especially knowing how into the Smiths The Killer is. That had to be fun too.
Yeah, you know, David Fincher, he knew he wanted one Smith song, which was How Soon Is Now, and he knew that he wanted that particular song for the sequence where the killer misses his target and kills the courtesan by mistake. So that was the only instance where David knew ahead of time that he wanted the Smiths. But there were many instances visually where you know, the killer's wearing these exact earbuds I'm wearing. And sometimes he'd only be wearing one, by the way, in which case we'd play music out of one speaker, which we got a lot of QC notes from Netflix saying, you know, the music is wrong. It's only coming out of one speaker. And
that's intentional, by the way.
That's intentional. And thank you for noticing that. And, you know, so we got a lot of notes like that, which again, David would push to do things that were out of convention. And that was a lot of fun to be challenged, and he'll push the sound team to go into a place that's a little uncomfortable, because your instinct is like, oh, people are going to think that's wrong. And his response is, I know, isn't that cool? So that's a lot of fun. But back to Smith's, David really wanted to fill out all these different tracks. So he experimented with different types of music, and he tasked Kirk initially to do find music cues and fill in Susie and the Banshees, and then at one point we thought, The Cure and some 80s music. We're trying to figure out, since the killer doesn't speak a whole lot aside from voiceover, the music could indicate and inform the audience, hey, he's a strange fellow because he has his musical taste, and that would teach us something about him. So then we thought at one point, what if he listens to Glenn Gould Bach fugues, and he's just some weird guy that only listens to Bach, so we did a version like that, which was interesting. And of course it didn't land ultimately, but there was a lot of people. Our music editor, Sally Bolt, helped out a lot, and did every single experimentation for Fincher. At one point, David says, just do a version that's this kind of music, do a version that's that kind of music. And I think he was smart, because he really wanted to make sure that when the Smiths, it was all Smiths, that we had exhausted all those other possibilities.
What was it like bringing sound, Ren, to that giant fight scene with all the thudding metal and flying fists and breaking glass? That was just if you'll pardon the expression, like an orgy of sound.
Yeah, that was a real team effort. Our entire sound crew, it was all hands on deck on that sequence. And it was interesting because we had production dialogue, Ray, originally, and the production dialogue had a lot of vocalizations. Most of them, the majority of the vocalizations, the grunting of the punches and what you would normally hear in a fight sequence in a film, and what we kind of expect to hear, we had those sounds, those vocal sounds. But David really didn't want to have those sounds. He thought, I don't want to have the fight sound like things that we've heard before if possible. And he said, what if they were quiet? They didn't vocalize all that much. And that was a really strange ask initially, because again, sound editor's instincts and a dialogue editor's instinct is to go, oh, all these vocal sounds. And so Rich, our dialogue editor, is like, are you sure this is a good idea? And I said, we have to do it. We have to, there are a few, of course, vocalizations, but that absence of vocals then created an opening to put more sound effects in, what you were just describing.
Yeah, that's really what you hear. You're right. You used to almost remember the old Batman series with the exaggerated pow, bop, boof.
Yeah, right.
You don't get any of that.
Right, you don't get any of that. And so because it was so empty of vocals, it became apparent that we had to fill in a lot of detail with Foley, with floor creaks, with the disparity of weight between the brute, who's 250 pounds, versus Michael Fassbender's character, which is, he's only 145 pounds. And David was really pushing us to sonically hear the difference between this big fellow and the small fellow. And because David and Eric filmed it nearly in the dark, it's basically in darkness, you can't sometimes tell who's who, right? Because it's so dark. So we needed to hear who was who by their weight. The brute was a bassier sound. The killer was a lighter sound, for example. And then, of course, all the props and little details that Fincher wanted to have. The killer picking up a bong and hitting him with the glass, and the texture of that, throwing him against the television, and the glass shattering, and the stretching of that. A lot of sounds were made, and everybody, like the whole team we were all cutting throughout that whole moment. And it took a long time to arrive there. And we got to a mix, and we invited our composers up, Trent and Atticus, for a playback. And Trent, there's a musical score that goes through that they composed, which is really very interesting as well. And Trent's only real note was, how come I don't hear them grunting? And we even got it from the composer.
There you go. We're going to wrap here in a minute,
Okay.
Ren, but I needed to ask you about your Academy Award record. You know, we're about awards here at Gold Derby. 9 nominations, no wins. Very impressive, and congratulations. But what does a guy got to do to win one of these things?
I don't know. The nominations are interesting. I actually the getting the nomination I feel is the win, and I don't say that just to say it. I actually mean it, because the way it works is that your peer group initially nominates. So the sound branch will nominate, and then once the sound branch nominates, then it goes to all the voting, all the voters. So to me, in a way, that's really wonderful, because it's your peer group that do the same kind of work that you do, nominating you. So I think that's the best part of it, to be honest.
That's the best way to look at it too. We're gonna have to wrap things there. Ren Klyce, good luck to you this coming awards season. The
Thank you,
Killer,
Ray.
starring Michael Fassbender, is streaming on Netflix. Thanks for joining us today at Gold Derby, Ren.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.